right, good evening, everybody. My name is Will Johnson. I'm the Vice President here at Rochelle Christie. So tonight we're going to be continuing our study on God and morality. As always, I'd like to remind you that we meet at the Union beforehand at 6 o'clock for dinner if you want to join us there, and then we can give you a ride over here. I'd just like to update everyone. We've actually updated our Rochelle Christie policies to more closely represent those of UNL. So we now require masks, and we are trying to maintain social distancing here. So if you do come in person for future meetings, just keep that in mind, be prepared for that, and we do thank you for your cooperation with that. I'd like to remind you about our debate next week. We're going to have it during our normal Rochelle Christie time here Wednesday at 7:30. It will be a debate on whether morality is subjective or objective, and I will actually be a part of that along with Matt and Ethan here and Joel Mormon, so please join us for that. Looking forward to that. Quite a bit. I would like to remind our online viewers that you can ask questions online via the YouTube chat, and we will be able to see those and get to them. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Ben Blowers. Thank you.
All right, my computer went to sleep, so let me pull that back up here. And we'll get off and running. It's like super quiet in here, which is unusual for just prior to getting started. Usually we're having to draw everybody together, so this is good. Yeah, it's the social distancing kind of does interfere with everything. All right, so we've got a tall order ahead of us tonight. We're going to be tackling 4 just relatively minor issues regarding justice and killing and the ethics and morality of those topics. Death penalty, war, self-defense, and lethal action by law enforcement. So relatively simple, not going to be too difficult to try to plug through in 50 minutes or so. So I'll do my best. No, but seriously, we're going to be looking at the ethics of those issues, and if it's ever permissible under the context of the ethics of life, how do we then look at issues where life and death are at play? So broadly speaking, we're going to be looking at the ethics of the use of force. So had to throw in the little joke here. Not the force, but we're going to be looking at the ethics of using force, specifically as it relates to the ethic of life. In other words, lethal force. Okay? So I'd be happy to welcome during the Q&A questions regarding, why does it keep doing that? That is weird. I'd welcome questions regarding non-lethal force, if that's something you're interested in, the ethics of maybe police force when it's used like that. But we're going to be focusing specifically on lethal force and when that may or may not be permissible. So the question we left off last week was, is it possible to uphold a consistent pro-life ethic in cases of war, capital punishment, self-defense, and law enforcement actions? So you remember the pro-life ethic is, it is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, right? That's what we've been defending when we looked at abortion and euthanasia and other forms of end of life, I guess you could say termination of life at the end of life, generally regarding age or illness or something like that. And I argued the first week when we looked at abortion that abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and intentionally fatal withholding also intentionally kill an innocent human being. And then a couple weeks ago, if you remember, I also argued a slightly different form of argument that it is always wrong to devalue any human life. Okay, and then laid out an argument for why some forms of ART or assisted reproductive technologies devalue some human lives. Okay, and then I argued therefore that abortion, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, intentionally fatal withholding, and some forms of assisted reproductive technologies are always wrong in light of those arguments. And we looked at differences of size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, pain, age, and illness as not rising to a level of, or not significant enough differences in order to change the morality of ending someone else's life. And then with the assisted reproductive technologies, we looked at using donor gametes, IVF, zygotic, intrafallopian transfer, surrogacy, and other forms of these reproductive technologies can demonstrate, not always, but some of them can demonstrate or indicate a devaluation of human life by placing the desires of adults over the well-being of children, commercializing procreation, victimizing women, and actually the buying and selling of human beings. On that basis, devaluing human life is wrong. Taking innocent life intentionally is always wrong. Therefore, all of these actions are or can be morally problematic and therefore never justified. However, this should cause us to ask if any form of killing is therefore justified, right? Because we've kind of been constricting down. Now, you're not generally going to find many people saying, hey, I think all of these, all of the above forms of killing are justified. But maybe in our culture or in conversations, that is sometimes what is argued or it is assumed that certain lives aren't worth living, and therefore it's morally permissible to allow those lives to be ended, or for those people to end their own lives. But if we're going to look at all forms of killing, or asking the question if killing is ever justified, in which situations would that be permissible, and how would we know? That's what we're going to look at tonight. So, in light of this, let's think through a few situations where human lives, innocent or not, might be ended. And those specifically, like I've mentioned, are these four categories. Now with war, we're looking primarily at the ending of life regarding enemy combatants and non-combatants, okay? For the sake of tonight, generally the discussion is not about those who are going into war because they are electing to do so, and so it's not, I guess, the morality of those lives being lost. If you decide or elect to go into war, the morality of your life being taken, if you did elect to do so, is not generally discussed when talking about the taking of human lives in the context of war. Now we could argue, as we'll look a little bit later, about the morality of going to war in the first place, but generally when we're talking about the ethics of killing, we're looking at enemy combatants and then non-combatant death. With capital punishment, we're dealing with guilty or innocent persons, okay? Self-defense is intentional or unintentional. Did you intend to kill or did you not intend to kill? If it's unintentional, there's an argument that could be made it was maybe accidental or a different form of killing that then wouldn't carry that same moral weight. And then with law enforcement, we're specifically looking at the lethal force that is used. And again, there we're looking at guilty or innocent persons and the ethics surrounding the taking of those lives by law enforcement. Now the question we're going to look at is the taking of human life ever just? So now with that kind of blazing speed intro into this evening, I'm going to give you a discussion question, and this one's formatted a little bit differently, but I want you to, if we can do this, try to figure out, let's see, maybe you four here, you guys over here, and then in the back. I think that's kind of where whoever's in the back, you can kind of get together. Is that three groups? Okay, so let's do it this way. I've got three scenarios here. You know what, I'll let you pick which scenario you'd like to tackle, okay? So we've got one dealing with capital punishment, we've got one dealing with military action, and another one dealing with law enforcement action. So you as a group, figure out which one of these discussions, or which one of these situations you're going to discuss, and then look at the ethics. How would you engage with this situation? So I'll give you 4 or so minutes here to look over that. Okay, so what issues did you guys tackle? I know some of you are still finishing up your conversations, but heard a little bit here and there. What did you guys overhear?
The first and the second one.
First and the second one? Okay, were you able to arrive at any consensus or conclusions?
I don't think so.
No. Okay, that's fair. Others?
On the second
Yeah.
one, I would say, to what you were saying, I think it's really difficult contemplating whether, I think the phrasing of the question is a bit weird, whether you're justified in killing innocent civilians. I think that perhaps you can still justify the military action with the consequence of the innocent civilians being killed. That doesn't mean that killing the innocent civilians is justified, but maybe that other action is justified.
Okay. Okay. What about you guys? Which one did you tackle?
We talked about the death penalty,
Okay.
and it is obviously in Scripture in places we agreed on that. We didn't really at the time come to much consensus beyond that.
Sure. Yeah, so as Christians, Scripture is clear that the death penalty is permissible or can be allowed, or at least was allowed at some time in the past. What about you guys in the back?
Yeah, we discussed the second one.
Okay, so no one took the third one. Okay.
That one was Vegas.
Yeah. These are difficult situations to deal with, but this is generally what we're talking about when we're dealing with the ethics of life and the taking action or using force that results in the death of another human being or number of human beings. So, as with the issues that we've looked at in the previous weeks, we need to establish now a framework on how to approach these issues that then we can apply to specific cases that can help us move forward when human lives are at stake. J. Darrell Charles is a fantastic thinker who's done a lot of work specifically in the area of war, the just war tradition, but generally use of force, or in general the use of force is what he's looked at. He's the director and senior fellow of the Bryan Institute for Critical Thought and Practice. He said this, the principles of justice remain the same whether they're applied domestically or in foreign affairs. He then continued, if justice is truly just, then there is a universal character to it that all people, all nations, all human beings can intuit. In other words, if there's such a thing as justice, these are my words, in other words, if there's such a thing as justice, then it doesn't matter if we're looking at home invasion, where the intruder gets killed, a police officer shooting a suspect, a state executing a convicted murderer, or a military dropping bombs on a city. The principles at play, or the principles that we need to bring to bear on each of those situations are the same. Okay? That's the argument that we're going with tonight. So what then are these principles of justice, like Darrell Charles is talking about? Well, I think the first one here that we can appeal to is what's often referred to as the golden rule, right? Which I've got there at the first line here, do unto others as you want done to you. And historically speaking, virtually no society, religious or non-religious, has not had a conception of this. I was doing some research, and in ancient Egypt, so this is about 2040 to 1650 BC, is when this phrasing was found. Now this is the command: do to the doer to make him do. Do to the doer to make him do. In other words, do to somebody else or do to someone else who does things what you would want done to you. Ancient Greece, avoid doing what you would blame others for doing, or do not do to others that which angers you when they do it to you. Ancient India had a similar conception. One should never do something to others that one would regard as an injury to one's own self. And that came from somewhere 400 BC to 400 AD. So a variety of different cultures from around the world have echoed what we see in Scripture, or most commonly know from Scripture, do unto others as you would have done to you, this concept of the golden rule. But there are a couple corollaries to that Darrell Charles articulated. So if you should do unto others what you want done to you, it follows then that you ought also to not do unto others what you don't want done to you, right? And then also, you should not allow things to be done to others that you don't want done to you. Okay, all of those follow from this golden rule. And these come into play especially when we're looking at issues of justice, whether it's the criminal justice system or international affairs, foreign affairs, specifically military conflicts or other military interventions. So that's one of the principles of justice that's historically been commonly accepted in a general sense. Another principle of justice that comes into play is a distinction between violence and force. Now that distinction, violence, I think it's helpful to understand that the definition or a proper definition of violence is that application of force which undermines law, politics, and society. So when you talk about a violent criminal, that's someone who's undermining the peace within a society. Whereas force is that application which undergirds and protects law, politics, and society. Okay? So it's a fine distinction, but one that is key when we're looking at the correct application or incorrect application of force. And then also this idea that peace must always be justly ordered. Now as I studied this, I thought it was interesting, currently over the last 4 or 5 months, we've been hearing numerous chants of no justice, no peace, right? This has been something that's been kind of instigated through a variety of different circumstances, whether it's the killing of a suspect by a police force or some other situation where somebody has been killed. It's resulted in protests and other activities where this chant is often employed, no justice, no peace. Now, the proper ordering or peace has to rely on the proper ordering of justice or the important place of justice. So there's actually a strong element of truth. If there is no justice, then there can be no peace. It's not that there will be no peace, there can be no peace if justice is not already there. Unfortunately, though, peace is often inadequately defined as a relative absence of violence. Okay, now violence is that application of force that undermines a society. And so sometimes we look at, well, if that violence isn't happening on a large scale, then yeah, we live in relative peace. But I would argue that the peace properly defined would be the environment in which human flourishing can be maximized, and it can only be achieved when justice prevails, right? Thomas Aquinas said that the peace is the fruit of justice. Okay, peace can only follow from a justly ordered society. Peace requires that righteousness be upheld, or good deeds be upheld and encouraged, and wrongdoing be punished. Right? We would say it's an unjust society that would tolerate the torturing of innocent civilians and the raping of women or men. Right? If a society tolerated that type of behavior, even though there wasn't any looting or there wasn't any stealing going on or maybe no murders, but they tolerated that other type of activity, we would say, no, that's an unjust society. So peace both requires that righteousness or good actions be upheld and encouraged, and wrongdoing be punished. And justice is what mediates both of those things. So, as a Christian, or I should say, if Christianity is true, then we as humans can only know peace or experience peace if and when we know the Prince of Peace, Christ Jesus. And to that end, those of us who know and follow Christ ought to work toward establishing justice, sustaining peace, and punishing or preventing injustice in all of its forms. Right? A lot of times, people want justice and want law and order, but refuse to or shy away from standing against injustice in all of its forms, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, whether it's abortion, or other forms of oppression, slavery, and so on. Those types of injustices must not be tolerated. And in fact, as Christians, this is what we're commanded to do. Micah 6:8 says, "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God." Proverbs 31:8-9 says, "Open your mouth for the mute." In other words, those who can't speak for themselves, you ought to speak for them. "For the rights of those who are destitute. Open your mouth. Judge righteously. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy." Okay? This is what we as Christians are called to do. And then I would argue if Christianity is true, then this is not simply something that we're called to do, but this is something that everyone ought to do. Again, if Christianity is true. There's no room for Christians to participate or perpetuate injustice, nor can we as Christians stand idly by while injustice is being perpetrated by others. Okay? Again, if Christianity is true, then this is what we're called to do. And so when we're looking at issues of oppression or injustice culturally, or we're looking at situations where the loss of life, of another human life, could happen, we need to stand in that gap and say, how ought we conduct ourselves as a society or as individuals in those situations? Okay? So that's just kind of setting the framework. Again, like I said, if Christianity is true, then these are things that then follow from that truthfulness. Now, the core tenets of just war tradition incorporate these principles of justice helpfully. And that's kind of the framework that we're going to be working from. But having looked at these principles of justice now, I want to give you a chance to discuss this again. So in light of these principles, I can pull it up here, are protesting, rioting, looting, or vandalism justified responses to injustice? So thinking back to the Golden Rule, thinking back to the distinction of violence and use of force, or force in general, and thinking back to the need for a society to be justly ordered. Right? Thinking back to those things, in light of those principles, are protesting, rioting, looting, and or vandalism justified or unjustified responses to injustice? That would be the question. So go for it. I'll give you a few minutes here. All right. So in hearing some of the conversation, I know some people were saying, oh, these aren't properly defined, or we don't have definitions of these 4 actions, and that makes it super hard. Yep, it does, because this is the challenge that we deal with. How do we define these things? And depending on how certain actions are defined, that can actually change. You know, if we say, if the definition of looting was simply walking into the store and paying for something, of course, then we would say that's not wrong, right? But that's not the definition of looting that we generally work with. All I'm saying is definitions matter. And so I'm encouraged to hear that all of you are saying we need proper definitions before we can identify the moral course of action here. So just saying, I'm encouraged to hear some of the discussion that's going on. Well, I'm going to, kind of full disclosure here, I do approach these questions from a just war tradition perspective. And we're going to get into that. I think as I've studied the issues of war and military intervention, that seems to be the most comprehensive means or method of engaging or navigating these waters. And then what we're going to be doing is applying those just war principles to the other 3 situations. And you can tell me at the end if I made a misstep, and I would encourage pushback. But let's turn our attention to just war tradition now. Like I like to do, a brief history. Just war tradition, and I'm using tradition as opposed to just war theory, which is actually how I was first exposed to it. Commonly it's referred to as just war theory. The reason I'm choosing to refer to it as just war tradition is because a theory is malleable. It can change over time and does change over time. Whereas a tradition is something, Daryl Charles used the analogy of a river, right? You've got a flow of water that is continuing its course, from its source of origin all the way to the ocean. It might encounter some ponds, some marshes, even some large lakes or very broad rivers, but there's an undercurrent, there's a flow that is consistent all the way through, and that's kind of how I would think historically of the just war tradition or just war thought. Started with Ambrose, who was a mentor to St. Augustine. St. Augustine then helped lay some of the foundations of just war thought, and then Thomas Aquinas actually articulated, I wouldn't say the first articulation of just war theory, but he really kind of delved into it. Although briefly in Summa Theologica, he only briefly has a discussion about war, but he really does set the foundations for the tradition there. Martin Luther also actually had quite a bit to say, because he was living during a time where Europe was dealing with a significant military conflict. Hugo Grotius is actually considered the father of international law. He's also one of kind of these stalwart figures in the tradition of just war. And there are many others that I'm skipping over, but those are a few big names. If you're going to look into the topic of just war tradition more, those are some names you're going to hopefully run into quickly. Now, just war tradition kind of mediates between 2 extremes when we're looking at military intervention specifically. The first one being pacifism, which broadly speaking is an ideology that holds that the use of force is never justified. Okay? Now, within a pacifist or a primarily pacifist camp, you're going to have a spectrum of everything from literally the use of force is never justified in any context. And I've talked with people who even held that defending, let's say we had someone break in here and hold a gun to Zach's head, say, I'm going to shoot him if you don't give me all of your money, and we couldn't get the money fast enough, and then he points the gun at Zach and shoots him, we would actually be unjustified in even trying to tackle the individual who took that action, right? So that's kind of an extreme form of pacifism, all the way to various degrees of when force and what types of force may be employed in certain situations, but generally, by and large, pacifism across the spectrum does hold that the use of force is rarely justified or is never justified. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got militarism, which is just the opposite. Use of force is always justified, or it needs no justification, right? You don't need to say, well, I'm justified in taking this military action, for example. I don't need to give any reasons. I'm just going to do it. That would be militarism. I would argue that both sides of the spectrum have some pretty significant flaws. Militarism, I think, is fairly straightforward. I don't know that many of us here would have to argue against that. I'm simply going to say, if use of force never needs any boundaries on it, then that immediately leads you into some very problematic situations. You can literally go down the street shooting people at the most extreme example because you're simply using force with no justification, right? That's an extreme example, but I think we can reasonably say that militarism in an extreme force or in an extreme sense is certainly morally problematic. Pacifism, on the other hand, I think can be well nuanced, but I would argue that it doesn't adequately account for the reality of evil in the world. Right? Pacifism, where the use of force is never or essentially never justifiable, it doesn't account for the fact that there are evil people in the world who take evil actions and must be restrained. And religiously motivated pacifism at least tacitly teaches that they, meaning other people, non-religious people, should get their hands dirty, do the work of law enforcement, military defense of a country, punishing evildoers and so on, while we, the religious people, remain pure or don't participate in that. Our religion holds that we should not take action. But I don't think, practically speaking, you would find a lot of that form of pacifists saying that it should be okay for murderers to be unchecked, right? They would say, well, no, I think murderers need to be checked or need to be prevented from taking additional human life, right? But that's a job for others, not part of our community. And I would simply say that as a Christian, that's an incorrect response to hold. Again, for the Christian, holding to pacifism, and I'm speaking here as a Christian to Christians, holding to pacifism does relegate the issues of justice to the jurisdiction of those who do not know Christ nor have a proper understanding of the human condition, justice, grace, righteousness, mercy, or redemption, right? If we relegate those issues of justice to those who do not know Christ, that we, I think, are very clearly shirking our duty to stand up for the oppressed, to oppose injustice, and so on, as we talked earlier. So, I'm not going to argue strongly against pacifism tonight, but I would say that I don't think that position effectively accounts for the realities of the world that we live in. Okay, so that's as much as I'll say on that. But just war tradition then kind of sits in the middle and mediates between these two extremes, tries to find a proper balance of when it is appropriate to take military action of any kind, if it's ever justified, right? The first principle that is undergirding is this jus ad bellum, right? The justice in going to war, or the just cause, or the just reason before going to war, right? And it has, as you can see, these three undergirding principles of justice in going to war. Just cause, remember the golden rule, doing unto others as you would have done to yourself, and some of those other corollaries. Don't allow to be done to others what you wouldn't want done to you. So there's a very real aspect within just war tradition. If a military intervention is going to be just, it can be justified to stand up for the oppressed, to stop injustice. It doesn't always have to be a direct assault like we saw with, say, Pearl Harbor, right? There's a direct attack on our country, and therefore just war might suggest that there's certainly a just cause in going to war. But it doesn't always need to be a direct attack. It can be standing up for another nation state that's being oppressed or unjustly attacked. The second underlying principle is right intention. So here we can't ever accurate or definitively discern the intentions of another person, right? But the right intention needs to be one of those aspects that comes into play when we're looking at whether it's appropriate to go to war. Okay? And one of the ways that you can help determine whether the right intention exists is looking at a pattern of evidence, right? You can look at the other conflicts that a nation state maybe has engaged itself in or involved itself in, and if it tends to be more of a conquest, or tends to be to grab power or to destroy, do ethnic cleansing or genocide or something like that, well, clearly we would say that even if they're claiming, no, we're we have this other just cause, the pattern of evidence might suggest otherwise. And if that right intention doesn't exist, it wouldn't be a justified, or there wouldn't be a just intention for going to war. The third underlying principle here in this first category of justice in going to war is legitimate authority, right? All of us here, even if we had 100% consensus, could not declare war on Venezuela, right? We are not the proper authority in order to take that action, right? In the same way, as we're going to look later on with law enforcement, again, I cannot go down the street and execute someone. If we went down to the state penitentiary, someone who's on death row, we couldn't go down there and execute them ourselves because, again, we don't have the proper authority. So there has to be a proper authority, and when we're looking at going to war, the only proper authority that can take that is the governmental structure that is at play, right? You can't have a subset of the population voting to go to war or something like that. You would have to have the government itself, or the government itself would be the only authority that would be qualified to make that action. And then some of the more recent development, and by recent I mean maybe not in some of the original articulation of the just war tradition. A more recent addition is that war should be engaged only as a last resort. Okay? So after diplomatic efforts have failed and have been exhausted and there's no hope for a diplomatic solution, then and only then is a military action justified, according to just war. Now, there is some discussion, we can get into this in the questions if you want, I'll just throw this out there, but there is some question within the just war tradition as to the morality of preemptive strikes. Okay, so preemptive strikes, something like earlier this year with the essentially assassination of General Soleimani, if you remember that, where the U.S. Took a smart bomb and took him out as a preemptive strike. He was a terrorist, or he organized a lot of terrorism and had been instrumental in numerous attacks against the U.S. And even though he wasn't actively taking a gun and shooting U.S. military personnel or other innocent civilians at that moment, they preemptively, based on the intelligence they had at the time, they preemptively killed him. And there is some discussion whether that, within a just war framework, can be justified or can be morally permissible. We can talk about that later, but I just want to let you know, like, this isn't, even within the just war tradition, although, like I said, there is a consistent flow of thought throughout the millennia that this has been articulated, there is some more recent discussion about the ability or the moral permissibility to preemptively take military action. The second principle here is jus in bellum, justice in or during war. And here we've got, again, three different principles that undergird the second, I guess you could say, qualification or piece of the framework that we have to have in play within a just war tradition. The first one is discrimination. And here I'm not saying, well, we're looking down on someone. Discrimination here is more understood in the classical sense of discriminating between enemy combatants and civilians or non-combatants. Now within the conversation, this is kind of known as non-combatant immunity. In other words, those who are not participating in the war are held to have immunity. They are not guilty, relatively speaking. We're talking relative morality here, not specific morality or morality or guilt. I guess that was the word I was looking for. So non-combatant immunity is this idea that you shouldn't go in and just indiscriminately or kind of willy-nilly go killing people, right? Well, we have the just cause, we have right intention, we're the legitimate authority, and we've already exhausted our diplomatic defenses. Let's just go blow this place up, right? that would be an unjust action. Even though the war itself or the military intervention may itself be justified, going in with that type of an action would be unjustified. The second principle is proportionality. In other words, the response in war must be proportional to the threat. Okay? So an easy example would be, we don't cut off the hands of 5-year-olds who steal a cookie. Okay? That, we can see right there that would be a disproportionate punishment for the violation of mom and dad's rules. In the same way, we just scale it up when we're talking about international affairs, and we recognize that if there's a small terrorist organization operating within, maybe even with some support from another nation's government, it would be wrong to go in and carpet bomb the entire nation so that we wipe out that small terrorist organization or those bad actors. We would have to take a proportional response. And then finally, again, this is more of a recent development, and again, not within the last 20, 30 years, but not maybe as well articulated in the early stages of just war tradition. That final one is limited objectives. In other words, wars seeking annihilation, unconditional surrender, or total destruction of a nation are not moral. So you can't go in, even if, again, the war itself is justified, with just war tradition, you can't go in and seek the destruction as retribution, essentially, for the action taken against you. And then the final articulation of just war theory comes in this jus post bellum, or justice after war. And this is something that often isn't articulated as much or isn't talked about as much when we talk about the morality of military intervention or going to war. But it has with it this idea of a commitment to rehabilitation or reconstruction. And what do I mean by that? It's this idea that a conquering nation must have a plan for rebuilding or helping those who have survived to restructure their nation. Okay, you can't just go in there and lay waste to the land and then leave. A war that is just should be conducted in such a way that after the enemy has been conquered, you have a plan to help those civilians, help those immune non-combatants, if you will, be able to restart their country. Because we don't seek the genocide or the destruction of an entire people group, even if we justifiably went to war and conducted ourselves well in that military action. We have to then have a plan or have a desire to help them after the fact. And this really gets back to this idea of seeking human flourishing, right? We ought to, as humans, seek human flourishing. And so you can't go, well, we're going to reconstruct this country, right, that we've now conquered, but we're going to pipe all of their oil directly to us, or we're going to set up all their, rewire all of their energy production and power our homes, right? You can't take advantage of that conquered nation or enemy, former enemy at that point. You can't take advantage of them in that restructuring. No, you should seek the flourishing of that country and of those people. And I would say it's important to note that the principles of jus post bellum, or justice after war, only apply in circumstances of war, because in each of the other three cases, capital punishment, lethal self-defense, and lethal law enforcement action, that action is final, right? If you use lethal force in self-defense, there's no rehabilitation or reconstruction in that sense. So even though we're applying a just war tradition framework to those other three circumstances, this justice after war concept only applies within the context of war. Now, it is important to note, now that we've kind of looked at the very broad overview of the basics of what just war tradition holds, it's important to note that just war tradition does not justify every war. It does not even justify every action taken within a just war. I think that's often a misconception about the tradition. That, well, if you argue from a just war tradition, then you must support going to Vietnam or Iraq or Korea or any of the other military inventions that the U.S. has been involved in our context, right? That's not necessarily the case. Just war tradition does not seek to justify past actions, or you need not justify any past war in order to hold to just war tradition. Just war tradition simply seeks to lay a framework for which or through which we evaluate any military action. Okay? And even if you then say, okay, going into war in this context is justified, that doesn't then therefore give you a blank check for all the actions taken in that war, right? It doesn't justify every action in a war, even if that war is waged justly. So, now with this framework in mind of just war tradition, how might you engage in these following discussions? And again, I'll let you figure out in those same groups, figure out which one of these situations you'll talk about, and I'll give you another 4 or 5 minutes here to talk about them. Okay. You guys wrestle with these a little bit, or was it kind of easy? Right. Yeah. These are difficult situations, and we'll walk through these now with this kind of maybe just war framework or these principles in mind that we've articulated here in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Let's now apply those to these situations here. Okay. So the first one, is the state justified in executing an individual who was rightly convicted of the premeditated murder of 5 innocent people after planning the crime for months? Right? Well, in states here in the U.S., in states where capital punishment is still on the books, which is 28 different states, the death penalty is reserved for those who have committed only the most heinous of murders. And there's actually, it's not just say, well, it's a heinous murder, death penalty. There are actually some principles there that increase the level of severity or heinousness, if you will. The first one is willful. It has to be an act of the will to murder. The second one is premeditated. This idea that it was planned, it was thought out, it was intended for a long time. There was no, I heard somebody say, there was no potential insanity or momentary insanity claim that could be made. No, this was intended. The desire was to kill others or take innocent life, and plans were set out in order to do that. The different states often, or the statutes will often have a discussion of this laying in wait or lying in wait idea, which is actually, interestingly, an allusion to Proverbs 1:11, which says, the writer of the Proverbs says that you should stay away. He's giving encouragement and exhortation to his son, and he says, stay away from those who lie in wait to shed innocent blood. And then goes into a discussion about that. But this idea of lying in wait, seeking life to take intentionally with planning. And then often, not always, but often the number of murders that have happened, if there's a repeated or a repetition in that crime, all of those factors come to play in these states where capital punishment is still on the books. And I assume all of you know capital punishment is simply another or a more technical term for the death penalty, right? Don't want to cause any confusion there. So is that action, so that's what the statute holds, or those are some of the thresholds that must be met before capital punishment can even be given to a convicted criminal. But how do we then apply this framework? Is that action or that potential consequence ever justified? And so we can go down this framework. Well, is there just cause? In other words, are we meaning the government or the legitimate authority, are we seeking to uphold justice? If the answer is no, then no. Capital punishment would be unjustified. Is there right intention? Is the motivation justice? Is it revenge? Or is it making an example? Right? Those would be intentions that could potentially then take capital punishment off the table. Is there a legitimate authority? I used the example earlier of us going down and executing someone who has been rightly convicted of a crime. Okay? That would be illegitimate, and therefore capital punishment would be wrong. It wouldn't actually be capital punishment because that type of a punishment can only be carried out by a legitimate authority or a government, right? Discrimination. Is the person guilty? Are they innocent? That's certainly important. Proportionality. And this is where a lot of people actually get hung up, or maybe where a lot of the positions diverge on the issue of capital punishment is the death penalty, is taking the criminal's life or the suspect's life, ultimately, or at that point they wouldn't be a suspect, they would be a convicted criminal. Is that punishment proportional to the crime that they committed, right? Again, like I said, we don't give the death penalty to people who have embezzled from their company, right? There seems clearly not to be a proportionality. There's no consistency between the type of crime and the punishment administered, and so we would say no, that would be unjust for someone to be executed for stealing from grandma, right? But with the discussion of punishment for murder, I think there can be a coherent argument made that the death penalty is certainly proportional. It fits the crime. Finally, there's this discussion of deterrence. And this is actually stepping outside of the just war framework a little bit, but this is something within the discussion around capital punishment. This is something that needs to be talked about. And there are two types of deterrence that are generally talked about when looking at this specific consideration. And the first one is immediate deterrence, right? Now, what do I mean by that? That's this idea that someone who has committed a murder, if they are executed, if their life is taken from them, they will be deterred from ever taking another life, right? So there is a very real sense of immediate deterrence. They will no longer be able to take an innocent human life. The second one is with the idea of deterrence, and this is something that can't actually be studied, but it does seem, I would say, reasonable or at least plausible that it exists. It's the idea that if one knows that the death penalty is a possible punishment, it stands to reason that that will deter some people from committing murder, right? In the same way that deterrence works very well, maybe a different example, or I'm going to assume that all of you are law-abiding drivers, right? And when you hit a construction zone, what is one of the signs that shows up there other than like merge left or merge right? Fines double in construction zones. What does that often cause us to do? Like we were just on the interstate a couple weeks ago, and I'll admit, sometimes your foot gets a little heavy and you're going, instead of 75, you're going 80 or something like that on the interstate. You hit that construction zone, you're like, ooh, fines double? I mean, I don't know what the fine is to begin with, but if it's doubled, I'm probably going to slow down, right? So there is a real sense in which I was deterred from committing a crime, right? Just scale it up a little bit with murder. If the punishment for murder is losing your own life, that may possibly very well deter someone from actually committing murder themselves. Now, why can't we study this or gather data on it? Because generally you're not going to find people walking around being like, hey, I would have murdered somebody, but because of the penalty, I didn't want to. So just so you know, you're all safe, right? There's a reason why there's not data on that. But I think it stands to reason that, that there is a level of deterrence there. So both immediate and, I guess what I'm referring to, unknown deterrence. Now, again, remember what Darrell Charles said. The principles of justice remain the same whether they're applied domestically or in foreign affairs. Okay, so applying these same, the same framework of just cause, right intention, authority, discrimination, proportionality, and so on. The principles of justice, if justice exists, can be equally applied or can be applied to every situation. So then looking at law enforcement, I guess I didn't give my answer to that question of the person rightly convicted, right? So I took off the table there the potential that he's an innocent individual because again, pro-life ethic, it's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Capital punishment is an intentional killing of a human being, but if they're rightly convicted, then they're guilty, right? That's how a pro-life ethic would be consistent in that. So my position on the, given the very limited specifics that I gave in that situation is, yes, that could be a legitimate action that a government would take. Looking at law enforcement, so here's the scenario I threw at you. Imagine you are a law enforcement officer and a suspect who has a history of erratic, violent behavior, is holding a knife to the throat of a child and threatening the child, and I didn't have room to write this, but also saying, if you police officers take one more step, I'm going to kill the child, right? But refuses to let this child go, right? The question then is, would lethal action be justified? Would it be justifiable or would it be morally permissible to take the life of that person even though there's no immediate harm to the law enforcement officer, right? Again, let's apply that framework. Is there a just cause? Is a law enforcement officer seeking to uphold justice? Is the motivation for taking that lethal action, potentially, is the motivation saving or protecting innocent life? Is the authority rightly placed? In other words, are we talking about a law enforcement officer or are we talking about someone who doesn't necessarily have that authority? That is so weird. Apologize. Is the person guilty, right? In this situation, I think we could probably argue that yes, someone who's holding a knife and threatening an innocent person, they're guilty, right? They haven't even been to court of law, but our justice system functions from a presumption of innocence, but we can clearly see that that person is guilty of unnecessarily endangering another human being. Okay, so in that moment, we would say, yes, they would be guilty. And then is the action proportional to the crime? And again, here, this is where maybe some of us might diverge in how we would answer the question, right? No loss of life has yet occurred, as would be the case involving capital punishment, but the potential loss of innocent life, or the protection of that innocent life, again, giving my argument, or giving my position, would be that yes, that could be potentially a justified action. Not in every case, but given the certain specifics, if this person has already, that's why I put in a history of erratic, violent behavior. This person is known to be unpredictable and not disregarding of the health or well-being of others around them. In that case, maybe given those situations or those specifics, I would say, yes, that law enforcement action could be justified. And then it would, in our country, it would be up to the courts to determine if those, all of those criteria were met, right? Abraham Kuyper, who was a prime minister of the Netherlands back in the early 1900s, 1901 to 1905, brilliant thinker. He was a prime minister, he was a theologian, he was a journalist, an award-winning journalist, and he was a pastor. He said that the highest and most sacred attribute of a sovereign, so in this case he was talking about his context, which has a monarchy, or at that time had a monarchy, or I would say the sovereign state, the sovereign nation, or the government. The highest and most sacred attribute of the sovereign authority is that he upholds justice. Okay, and this is echoing what Paul said in Romans 13:3 and 4, talking about as Christians, our interactions with the government. And Paul said here, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority?" So in other words, would you like to not fear who's in authority? Then, or if so, do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And I had the thought, I'll be honest, I'm a Marvel fan, and I was like, the first Avenger. It wasn't Captain America. It was the first legitimate authority that God put in place. Bad joke, but I had to throw it in there. But Scripture here, again, as Christians, if Christianity is true, Scripture actually articulates that the purpose or the function of a rightly ordered government is to carry the sword, or to enact up to and including the death penalty, or to enforce the laws that are on the books, protect those who do what is good. So here my answer would be yes, in this situation, potentially, that action could be justified. Not always, but could be justifiable. And then finally, here's this one. If a person breaks into your home and shouts, "Give me your money," would you be justified in using lethal force against her? Right? Now, I heard some of your responses. I don't know what all of you, or if any of you, actually tackled this one. But I would argue on this face, no. And here's why. This would not be justified. You would not be justified in using lethal force against this individual. But the framework that you would have to work through is your or another person's innocent life in danger? Given these few little facts that we have about the situation, it doesn't appear that there's any imminent danger to your own life. Money is replaceable, right? It's not the highest good by any sense of the word. And so, while theft is wrong and not to be punished, it wouldn't be proportional, looking down at the fifth criteria there, it wouldn't be proportional to take a life simply for the theft of money. Is your intention protecting the innocent? Well, it might be, but money does not have any moral status. You may not need to protect other life using lethal force, because that person may be completely unarmed and they're just looking to get lucky. robbing somebody who has lots of money. Again, is the authority rightly placed? Okay, so now in this situation, given these circumstances, no, the lethal action would not be justified. There can be situations, I would argue, where using lethal force to protect another person's life or to prevent imminent harm or loss of your own life, self-defense can be justified under those circumstances. So again, depending on the situation, the authority, you may not have the authority to kill someone for stealing, but you may have the authority or the moral justification if that person is all of a sudden, has already killed 2 people in your house and they're coming into your room, right? You would be defending innocent life at that point. Is the person guilty? Well, in this case, yes, they're guilty of demanding money unjustifiably, but they're not guilty of a capital crime or one deserving of the death penalty. And finally, like I talked about, proportionality. Is the action taken used as a last resort? And a last resort here would certainly not be taking their life. So like I said, we did a high flyover of all 4 of these situations, hopefully providing you with some principles that can then allow you to engage with the particular situations, right? I just heard, well, probably most of you are familiar, a couple days ago, I think 2-3 days ago, another person was shot by a law enforcement officer, and I don't even remember off the top of my head where that happened. But apparently, as I've heard it, and again, new details may come out, that person rushed to the law enforcement officer with a knife, right? So how would we approach that situation? We can talk about that, but I would encourage you, now you've got the tools that you can pull out and say, okay, was that a justifiable action? Was there legitimate authority? Was there just cause, right intention, and so on down the list? It can give you a framework to then approach these types of difficult ethical decisions that we need to engage in as members of this society. So, now kind of zooming all the way back. This was just kind of a fun project I've been working on over the last number of weeks, and I'm calling it my chart of death. You can think about maybe a better chart name that kind of is morbid, but this is something I've been working on, and you can see here, probably for those of you online, this is a little too small for you, but basically I've got death here, the different types of death. And then green, it doesn't carry any moral weight. If the type of death, or there are certain instances of a death occurring that may not carry moral responsibility for anyone. And then yellow, it can depend on the situation. Red, never morally permissible. That's kind of what I was working with here. So you can see I've got death, and then intentional death and unintentional death. And you can kind of work through this. I thought I'd just kind of throw this up there because this might be helpful in kind of seeing how we navigate these issues of the ethics of life when specifically looking at loss of life. Okay? So up here you've got euthanasia, never morally justified because it's an innocent person, it's intentionally killed. Right there, that takes it off the table. Homicide, obviously. Capital punishment, it can be justified if they're not innocent, but if they're an innocent person, capital punishment is not justified. In war, you've got enemy combatants and non-combatants, and you can go down the list. I tried to cover all of them. If you guys think of another situation, oh, Ben, here's a type of death that you don't have on your list, I'd welcome the input, because I'd love to fit it in there and see where it fits. But I found this to be helpful just in my own thinking of how to navigate the myriad of ethical dilemmas that we are faced with when dealing with issues of death and or killing. So I'll leave that up there here for now, but you're welcome to ask more questions or, yeah, I'll open it up to everyone. No questions. I covered it all. Nope, never mind. Tanner, go for it.
I got a tough one for you, Ben.
Okay.
Wherever you're ready. Did the wars in the Old Testament that were commanded by God uphold the tenets of just war tradition? I'm mostly thinking about the Canaanites and the Mennonites.
Okay. Yeah, so the question is the destruction of the Canaanites, and was that justified, or would that fall under the just war criteria? So this isn't my answer, but I would say that it is somewhat difficult to evaluate the the situation. Had we been in that situation, would just war have applied, because just war tradition hadn't been invented then? However, building a framework like that, I think we can, with a I'd say relatively reasonable degree of accuracy, have enough knowledge of the situation to help us navigate that question. So I'll do my best. My response to that would be looking back at the list of criteria, right? You've got just cause, and there, I would say on a biblical framework, yes, these people were guilty of incredible evil, and so they were guilty. They were certainly guilty before God. Scripture is clear that all have sinned and fallen short. In other words, there is no one who is right before God or has right standing before God, and because of that, God is just in holding accountable those people who have rebelled against him. Now, the means of carrying out retribution or carrying out that punishment for rebellion is up to God as the legitimate authority. And so should he choose to utilize an opposing army as to be the tool of his judgment, that would be justifiable. I would argue yes. And again, if we looked at some situations, because there were some times in the Old Testament where the war was unjustified or the military action was unjustified, and God actually punishes the Israelites for that. So we would have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but I would say, broadly speaking, that yes, the conquest of Canaan was justified because you had right intent. It wasn't genocidal. It was military conquest to take back land that had belonged to the ancestors. It was just cause. It was a legitimate authority, the authority being God himself, and the Israelites were the tools. The actions, though, that were taken, that's where some question, and we would probably have to dive into the specifics, whether the actions in each of those battles or military actions would be justified. So maybe on a broad, if we really wanted to nail down an answer, I would say yes, in general, that they would fall under an appropriate understanding of just war tradition. But if we started delving into details, we might come to a different conclusion. That'd be my broad answer. Yeah.
Is it morally wrong to, as a lawyer, defend a convicted murderer?
Okay. Yeah, is it morally wrong as a lawyer to defend a convicted murderer? Just as a point of clarification, they wouldn't be convicted if you were defending them. Now, and I don't say that to make light of the question. I'm just saying defending someone accused of murder is what would be happening. Although, in the sentencing phase of the justice system, you would be defending a convicted murderer. So then you would be saying, okay, this person has been convicted of homicide. Now, what is the penalty that is going to be applied to that individual? So in that case, yes, you would be an attorney working to defend a convicted murder. So making that distinction, I think, is important. But to answer the question, I would say yes. And I don't think I would need to qualify that in any way. And here's the reason why. As a defense attorney, your interest should be, at least, the upholding of justice and ensuring that the person that you are defending, the suspect that you are defending, is actually guilty. Like, you're not going to determine the guilt, but you are going to ensure that they are only convicted if guilty. In other words, you're going to make sure that if your client is innocent, they're not going to be unjustly accused or convicted of a crime. So an attorney who is defending someone who is accused of even heinous evil would be justified in defending that person because they would be hopefully seeking to uphold justice and uphold righteousness and make sure that the law is followed. I actually, a number of years ago, talked with a defense attorney, and I asked him that very question. I was like, how do you, like, what would you do if you had somebody who had, skinned alive a dozen people, and then you were asked to defend this person? He's like, well, as an attorney, you actually do have the ability to say, nope, I won't defend that person. I can't in good conscience defend them. So you do have that ability. If you didn't have a moral inhibition or a conscience or just a revulsion, and you felt you could give a good defense of that individual, then maybe they would even confess to you that, yes, I did this, I'm guilty, and I don't even care. At that point, your goal may not be getting them off the hook or clearing them of the charges, but to ensure that the law is followed to a T. Make sure that their right to a competent defense is carried out. Make sure that they are that the jury is only presented with relevant facts and that they're not skewed or biased in one way or another. That the sentencing would be appropriate to the crime and so on. So yes, I would say an attorney, if they were so inclined, would certainly be doing even a moral good in defending someone accused of even heinous evil and guilty of that evil. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that kind of creates a problem where they are getting too much power in deciding how much someone is punished? When it's not always in the case of like direct murder. I think it's getting a lot of problems, but like depending on how much work they choose to put in defending this person and getting their charges or getting their sentencing lowered, it puts too much responsibility on them because if they're not as sympathetic towards this person and not putting as much work and likely this person would receive a much higher sentencing as opposed to if they press for them as much as to make them look as good as possible.
Okay.
Even if they're guilty. So is it like the set down is coming from a public defender being nervous in their field and having a really problem with it?
Yeah. So for those of you online, if I'm kind of capturing what you said, like what do you do in instances where maybe all the best attorneys won't take the case, or all maybe the competent attorneys won't take the case, or don't want to defend an individual, and so they get left with a public defender who is overtaxed. Has 50 cases that they're in various stages of litigation on, or something like that. And so then that person then doesn't get, or maybe gets a disproportionate sentence. Is that kind of what you're getting at? So in that case, I would simply say that is I think we could even say a miscarriage of justice. Like if there is, let's say for someone who gets caught with a relatively insignificant amount of drugs, right? But they have a whole bunch of money. They're upper class, economically speaking. They have a whole bunch of money, and their parents pay for a high-powered attorney, and that attorney is able to negotiate a very light sentence for this individual and so on. And then another person comes along, exact same situation, same amount of drugs, same type of drug, all that type of stuff, but doesn't have the money for an attorney, and so they get a public defender who often, like you said, or someone who's maybe working pro bono, which means for good. Like they're just working out of the goodness of their own heart to defend that case, but they simply don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to defend that single person well, and so they get a different sentence. I would actually say, that's a miscarriage of justice, and it may not reflect on the justice system itself. It simply reflects the fact that humans have limitations. Humans are fallible and can make mistakes, or can make errors that have bad results. The result of having a difference in sentencing could reflect that. It also could reflect just a bad law or a statute that was enacted poorly to allow that type of sentencing to occur. So I would definitely have a problem with that if that were the case. And I know that does happen in a lot of contexts, particularly with drug crimes. There's a lot of variance in the type of sentence that someone receives if convicted of a crime. And so, yeah, that's a huge problem I do see. Yeah.
And you acknowledge whether you were, as a lawyer, as a defense attorney,
Mm-hmm.
you acknowledge whether you were, what are they called, defendant?
Yeah, yeah.
Whether they're guilty or not. And you acknowledge whether they're guilty or not. Is it wrong to defend them? The reason I ask is because if you don't have knowledge of they're guilty or not, you many times will get somebody who is guilty of some crime set free of
Mm-hmm.
justice for that crime, which seems unjust, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I would say out front, if there is any person who is guilty of a crime who is set free, we would understand it to be an injustice, right? If they were actually guilty of the crime and they're set free, that would be a miscarriage of justice, or that would be a not appropriate application of the law. So
is it wrong for the lawyer to defend people without knowing whether the defendant is guilty or not?
no, I wouldn't say it is. Generally, again, in talking with, and I'm not an attorney, I feel like at this point I need to have that scrolling, like, this does not constitute legal advice, please see an attorney or whatever. I'm not an attorney, although I did some pre-law stuff in undergrad. But what I would say is that when I did talk with a defense attorney, he's like 99, I don't know the percentage, a high percentage of the times the defendant confesses to the crime, or is like, yeah, I totally did it. And the defending attorney knows that. It's actually in their best interest to have a full confession. And again, they're not legally obligated to disclose that confession to the court. That's, attorney-client privilege is what that's called. But it wouldn't be unjust for an attorney to not have knowledge of the actual guilt or innocence of the person and still defend them. In the same way, even if they know they're guilty, again, at that point, I think if the person confessed and said, yeah, I totally did the crime, whatever it was, at that point, the attorney's job might change in scope a little bit from trying to get the charges dismissed to trying to ensure that justice is carried out during the legal proceedings and that the sentence is then proportional or in the best interest of the client.
Do you think the lawyer has a responsibility to try and get a confession if they think there might be one before continuing their job? Because you're saying that this confession leads to a change in the scope of their job, their just job.
It might practically change the scope. I mean, sure, we could think of a situation where somebody's like, hey, I totally killed 50 people, and they only are charging with 2 people. At that point, if an attorney was like, well, we're still going to try to get you off the hook for those 2 murders, I would say that would be an unjust action to take, because that would now be working against the statute, which is homicide is wrong. Like, you ought not kill people is what the law requires, and the attorney's requirement is to act in the best interest of their client, but also to follow the law. And so to knowingly work against the law, I would say at a minimum would be unethical. It would be a misappropriation of that attorney's duty to actively or knowingly work against the law. So practically, that's why I'm saying I think their scope would change. But they wouldn't be obligated to then disclose that to the prosecutor and say, yeah, this person, already told me that they were guilty of everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I have no more questions, but the last thing I'll say is just
Sure.
to clarify, it is unjust to work to get the charges removed if you are aware that the person is guilty, but it is not unjust to work to get charges dismissed when you don't know what the person is guilty of.
I would say potentially, and here I'm speaking maybe more in a kind of an ultimate moral responsibility sense. They would be, in my estimation, someone who actively worked to get charges dismissed that they knew were actually correctly applied. That would probably be a miscarriage of justice, and would reflect on the character or the moral character of the attorney.
And when they don't know, that's specifically what I want.
Okay, and when they don't know, let's say the person never disclosed at all. They refused to talk other than answer a few basic questions. In that case, yeah, that'd be a difficult position for an attorney to be in. Given the weight of evidence, I think he would then, his duty would then have to be, where does the evidence lie, and ensure that the type of evidence that was introduced in court was proper, and so on. If he literally didn't know, I mean, all of us can make judgments and reasonable judgments on the guilt or innocence of a person. That's why it's a jury of our peers. It's not a jury of criminal law experts. It's a jury of peers, because the law understands, the justice system understands that we as society have the ability to reasonably come to a conclusion based on evidence. And in that case, the attorney would be able to do the same and may come to his own conclusion even, without a direct confession. That'd be my best stab at an answer. Yeah, go for it.
This is a little bit of a strange question, but assuming Christianity is true, why does worldly justice matter when there's going to be infinite justice?
That's a great question. Yeah, so assuming Christianity is true, why does worldly justice matter, or societal justice matter, when God ultimately, as the arbiter of justice, he is going to make all things right? Okay, that's a fantastic question. And I would simply point back to a couple of the verses that I recommended, in addition to a number of other things, but I would say we are commanded, we as Christians, if Christianity is true, we are commanded to stand for justice and uphold justice, which isn't just the punishment of evil, but it is the promotion or encouragement or incentivization even of good and righteous actions. So I would say that right there would provide sufficient reason for Christians and others to stand for justice, even though God will ultimately hold everyone accountable for their action. We understand that there are certain actions, all actions have consequences. Some just have good consequences and others have bad consequences, right? The consequence of obeying your parents is getting to go to the zoo, right? The consequences of not obeying your parents might be loss of privilege of going to the zoo, right? So there are good or positive and negative consequences. All of those consequences or all of those actions will result in some type of consequence. And so working to uphold standards of morality. So lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, homicide, murder, killing of innocent people is wrong. Those are moral standards that we agree on. Even if we don't agree on, I would argue that there's still moral standards that exist. If so, I would say that it is important for us to align ourselves with those moral standards to the degree that we can. Why is it important for us to do that? One, because if Christianity is true, we are commanded to do so. We're commanded to stand against injustice. And secondly, it aligns with reality.
Another thought I had down that same line then is similar to another question. It's just that, why does God ask us to fight against evil? Or why does he have angels fight against demons if Christianity is true? Because, God, if he exists, is omnipotent. He could snap his fingers and the battle would be over with.
Mm-hmm.
So why does he allow the battle to go on and on and on? And I think one answer to that, there's multiple, but one of them could be that there's something for us to learn or benefit from in the battle. So as we fight against injustice, as we fight against our own evil desires, there's things for us to learn in the battle. Yeah, he could just end the battle like that and defeat all evil with the snap of a finger,
Mm-hmm.
but by allowing us to do it or calling us to be a part of it, there's things for us to learn and grow and benefit from.
Yeah, that's another potential answer, that through enacting or seeking to promote justice and stand against injustice, our character is refined. I would also add, in addition to that, that's redundant, adding in addition. But in addition to that, I would say that God allowing us to participate in the promotion of justice and righteousness and the standing against injustice allows us to reflect him and the nature that he has created us with, and allows for, in his grace and mercy, allows for redemption and restoration to happen. So if he ultimately judged every single person the moment they took an act of sin or an act of rebellion, right? So once somebody, again, extreme example, once somebody murdered someone, God's like, ultimate judgment now. There's no opportunity for redemption. But God is a God of love. Again, if Christianity is true, God is a God of love. He's a God of mercy. He desires that none should perish. That's his desire. That's why he sent Christ, to redeem us from the penalty for sin. And so us being allowed to participate in that enactment of justice allows for someone who maybe has killed somebody or numerous people to repent of that and even be reconciled with the families of the victims and so on.
Is God's justice better than human justice?
Ultimately, yes. Because God, if God exists, and if the God that exists is the Christian God, then he is a God of perfection, of love, of immense and ultimate goodness and justice. And so, yes, because humans are not ultimately and completely flawless like God is, then I think even by definition, God's justice would be better. That doesn't then mean that we can't, in working towards justice, actually affect or come to just ends or just conclusions. So someone who is convicted of a crime and the penalty is proportional and so on, it fits the crime and all of those things, and us carrying that out, that wouldn't be a lesser form of justice, that would be justice. But in an ultimate sense, yeah. Adam, do you have something to add?
Well, just another hypothetical. I don't want to interrupt if you guys are continuing, but if you want to move on, I got another hypothetical. Or it's not actually a hypothetical, but
Oh, sure, yeah.
sorry for something different. So maybe you could run through the U.S. bombing of Japan in World War II through just war.
Yes.
Um,
I lost that
what do you
slide.
think about that with all the non-combatants that were killed with the nuclear bombs?
Yes, let me pull it up here. Okay. I anticipated this might be a question because I've been asked it a number of times in the weeks leading up to this talk. So if you'll bear with me for a few minutes here, I'll kind of run through this and kind of how nuclear warfare kind of plays into a just war tradition, if that's fair. So this would fall under the jus in bellum, or justice in war. What actions are permissible in war, or how should we conduct ourselves in war? So nuclear warfare falls under that category of the just war framework. Scott Ray noted that the only sufficient force to repel, so this is under the idea of proportionality, right, that the military action taken should be proportional to the threat. He said, only sufficient force to repel and deter the aggressor can be justifiably used. Now, there are some who hold to just war tradition that believe this criteria eliminates the moral permissibility of using nuclear weapons altogether. Okay, that criteria alone, because of the scope of the destruction or the amount of force, not even talking in mechanical or physical terms, but the amount of force that a nuclear weapon carries is so great that it is always disproportionate in a just war framework. It's always disproportionate in response to or in the course of a military action. There are just war proponents who hold that position. However, there are others within just war tradition that hold even nuclear weapons may be permissible if the aggressor's threat is great enough and or the moral cost of continued conflict outweighs the moral cost of the use of the nuclear armament. Okay? So what this means, and this is the framework that the U.S. military used when dropping the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The moral cost of a full-scale invasion of Imperial Japan was so great that they felt the moral cost, even accounting for the loss of non-combatant life, the moral cost was lesser in dropping the nuclear weapons. So that was the calculation that the U.S. military used, and they brought in a number of experts who helped them navigate that issue. Now, whether they made the correct decision, I guess we can discuss, but that's the calculation that they used. However, if we look down to the issue of discrimination, so again, within just war tradition, there are others who would respond and say, okay, even if it's proportional, the issue of non-combatant immunity presents a significant challenge to the use of nuclear weapons. In other words, because nuclear weapons are so massive in scope that it's, I would say, virtually impossible to avoid non-combatant death, then non-combatant death is unjustified, and therefore the use of nuclear weapons is essentially always unjustified because of that. But we can think here, and this does get into some kind of, I won't say murky waters, but some difficult waters to navigate. So nuclear weapons are basically bigger bombs, right? If we throw a hand grenade at an enemy combatant, right? Let's say we're in a just war, and when you're going to war, one side's trying to kill the other. That's the purpose of war on the battlefield, is the death of the enemy. And so they're shooting at you, you're shooting at them, you chuck a grenade, and let's say it ends up killing an innocent civilian, right? Would that be morally justified? There's a discussion there we could have, but with nuclear weapons, we're simply talking on the issue of scope. Like how the more death can come into play. I mean, if we're trying to eradicate, well, I'll use the example, let's bring it down in scope a little bit. Let's say there's a violent criminal in the neighborhood, and the law enforcement knows he's here somewhere. They don't come in and just carpet bomb the entire neighborhood, right? Shoot every living person within that perimeter, because that would be an unjustified response to the threat. And so there would be some who may argue that that's kind of what a nuclear weapon would do, is it's kind of just this idea of wiping out entire areas to eradicate the threat. Now, I will add that there's another consideration that was specific to the dropping in Hiroshima and Nagasaki of the nuclear weapons, and it was that within the Imperial Japanese framework at the time, Japanese soil, imperial soil, was sovereign land. It was sacred. They even believed in a demigod status, or a quasi-god, a type of god status for the emperor. And because of that status, all imperial Japanese soil was also sacred. It was a sacrilegious event for any foreigner to set foot on the soil. And because of that, the U.S. generals recognized that should we participate in a full-scale invasion, which is what would have been required, there were two options essentially that they saw faced. There was no potential for surrender. The Japanese refused to surrender, even to the point of committing suicide. Even when they were conquered, they would commit suicide individually to avoid surrender. It was a dishonorable thing. Having that knowledge, and the fact that, so surrender is virtually impossible to achieve, and this is sacred soil. The reality that the generals were faced with was the entire Japanese population rising up and becoming enemy combatants, whether pressed into service or electing to go into battle. And the moral weight of the loss of all of those lives, plus the American lives, they discerned was greater, they decided was greater than the moral weight of even the loss of non-combatants. Also, given the fact that it was likely, given the factors that they had at their disposal, it was likely that the population would rise up and become enemy combatants. There is a discussion that I think can reasonably be had whether they were in fact non-combatants or innocent civilians. So there are a lot of factors at play. I'll just kind of end with this here. Maybe this is getting a little bit too off into the weeds. Michael Walzer, in his book Just and Unjust Wars, outlines what he calls supreme emergency. And I just found this interesting. I thought it was an interesting thought to engage with when looking at nuclear warfare. He said, supreme emergency describes those rare moments where the negative value that we assign and that we can't help assigning to the disaster that looms before us devalues morality itself and leaves us free to do whatever is militarily necessary to avoid the disaster, so long as what we do doesn't produce an even worse disaster. So Darrell Charles kind of clarified a little bit that anytime supreme emergency is evoked, it is done with the knowledge that moral values and ethical norms are being broken, but not permanently suspended. And in that action is taken with great guilt and remorse. Okay? So in other words, there is this idea in a supreme emergency, and this is something that within just war tradition only would apply to nation states, the supreme emergency. And not all just war tradition adherents would agree with this supreme emergency idea. But it is the idea that there can be circumstances where the future destruction that will occur is so great that we can even knowingly violate moral and ethical norms to avert that moral disaster, even though we would do a moral disaster or cause a moral disaster ourselves. I'm just throwing this out there to kind of help you think through this. I'll be honest, this is something new to me even in my studies, and I haven't fully wrestled through it, whether I agree that there is such a thing as a supreme emergency. But it's kind of a recognition that nations go to war. War is inherently an evil thing. It's a heinous thing. In war, bad things happen, and sometimes when you're faced with only bad options, using or applying a utilitarian calculus can help you navigate those. But even as you're taking those actions or taking the action of dropping the nuclear bombs, recognizing that a great evil has been done, right? So that's kind of, did I answer the question? No, I didn't. I think it's possible to justify or allow for the justification of nuclear armament, but I don't know that specific instance was justifiable. I don't have enough of the knowledge of the specifics and what they had to deal with. But I would say that for just war to be specific or to be consistent, you need not justify every war that has been involved in the past, and you need not justify all of those actions. So it's possible to say, no, the World War II, for example, was a just war. It was justly entered and so on. But there were some unjust things that happened on both sides. Carpet bombing of British cities and carpet bombing of German cities, in which numerous, thousands of non-combatants died on both sides. That's an unjust act. Just war tradition adherents need not defend those actions, and so it's not necessary to defend the nuclear bombs to be consistent. But there are folks on both sides of whether that was morally permissible or not. So kind of there's that. And I would encourage you, if that's something that bothers you, look into it, because there's a lot of good, helpful resources on that. So you guys didn't know you were getting 2 lectures tonight, did you? Any other questions here? Yeah.
There are historical examples of when a side that wins the war, they'll take, so for example, on the winning side will take certain members of the losing side as slaves.
Yeah.
Historically, the cultural context in which, does that affect whether or not it's justified?
Yes. Yes, potentially. And so that would be the use post bellum.
Right.
So justice after war. Are we conducting ourselves justly after the war? If you're going into war, even if you have just cause and you conduct yourself rightly, but then you commit genocide, and genocide isn't simply the killing. It doesn't have to be the actual physical annihilation. It can be a cultural annihilation as well. And so enslaving an entire population or an entire, say, city may not be justified. It very well may call into question the entire justness of going into war in the first place under just war tradition.
Is there ever a situation in which doing that would be just?
Is there ever a situation? I laugh because it's difficult to say is anything ever justified or not justified, because there are a lot of situations. I would say yes, there have been times. I think within a Christian framework there are situations where the Israelites, for example, did take slaves from their conquered enemies, or enslave, if you will, their conquered enemies. And I think there is a way to navigate that consistently within a just war framework. So my basic answer would be yes, but again, we'd have to look at specific examples and navigate that well. And that's what Wesley's going to be talking about in 2 weeks, in part, slavery and racism. So make sure you come back for that. He gets to answer all those questions. I'll end it here. We've been going quite a while, but I'd welcome any discussion afterwards. And yeah, thanks for coming.
As you guys discuss, just keep in mind the social distancing stuff, and it's nice enough